Yesterday, I was ready to take my daughter to her soccer game. She was almost ready. I was ready, except I couldn't find my sunglasses. Looked upstairs in our bathroom, the last place I remember seeing them, but they weren't there. Looked downstairs where they normally are in my little key and wallet dish, but they weren't there. So I go to my car. That's the typical place they are if they're not anywhere else, but they weren't there either. I looked everywhere, but I could not find them. So I went back upstairs and looked again, and there they were. You ever have that happen? No, not you, I'm sure. Not sure how they made their way to being on top of a sweatshirt at the foot of my bed, but there they were. Black sunglasses on a black sweatshirt. I think it may have had something to do with a certain 3-year-old in my home, but I can't prove that. I walked past those sunglasses half a dozen times and did not see them. I was blind to them, just like many were blind to the blind man in John chapter 9. But Jesus wasn't. John 9 is not a story. It is a historical account of a blind man in Jerusalem being healed by Jesus, the Son of God. Now, on the surface, it's pretty straightforward. This man had a need, and Jesus, in love and compassion, met his need. However, this text goes way beyond that, as we're going to see today. This text, John 9, is about being born blind. Why do I say that? Well, the concepts of blind, seeing, sight, and eyes, these 4 concepts are mentioned 33 times in this chapter. But if you look for the word eyes in the rest of the book of John, you're only going to find that word 8 times in the rest of John, and you're only going to find blindness 4 times in the rest of John. It's this concentration of terms in one chapter that shows us blindness and sight and how that relates to Jesus. All of that is the big idea of John chapter 9. Now, this event that we're going to look at today takes place in Jerusalem. I tend to think it's still the Feast of Tabernacles, which started all the way back in chapter 7. It's still the last day, which is mentioned in chapter 7, verse 37. The last day of the feast was a Sabbath day, a day of rest. When nobody worked, they all went and they worshiped and they celebrated God's goodness in taking care of their physical needs that year. It is the same day that Jesus declares himself to be the light of the world in chapter 8, verse 12. It's the same day when Jesus went round after round with the religious leaders over who he really is. And it's the same day when his life was threatened by an angry mob after he declared himself to be God. It seems to me that much of chapters 7, 8, 9, and even 10 all happen on the same day, the great day, the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, in chapter 9, verse 1, this chapter picks up where chapter 8 leaves off. Remember, Jesus avoids being murdered in the temple. Chapter 8, verse 59. He went out of the temple, and as he leaves, chapter 9, verse 1, notice, he saw a man born blind. Now, the blind were not typically cared for in this culture. He had no job. He couldn't do any job. So all he could do was beg for everything that he had. He was considered scum, the lowest of the low, a nobody, a nothing. Why? He was blind because of God's judgment for his sin. That's why. That's what they believed. Now this man is going to be healed, so let's call this point number 1 the miracle. If you're taking notes, point number 1 is the miracle. He didn't become blind through some accident or illness. He was born blind, verse 1, meaning he's never, ever known anything other than darkness. He has never seen anything at all. Keep that in mind. Now, throughout this chapter, we're going to see various people interact with this man, and those interactions begin with Jesus' disciples, verse 2. And Jesus' disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? In other words, if you're blind, God is punishing you for your sin. Bad things happen to bad people. Now, they're right about this, and they're wrong. They're right in that everything like blindness is the result of sin that came into the world, distorting God's original good design. So they're right about that. It is the result of sin, but they're wrong that his blindness was the result of his personal sin or the personal sin of his parents. If you think about it, they see this man as an object of inquiry. Hey, I got a question about him. Jesus, however, sees him as an object of mercy. Verse 3, Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." Did you catch that? This man is blind for many years. Why? That the works of God might be displayed in him. He was blind. He only knew darkness for many, many years so that people could see the effect of God's work displayed in his life. Interesting, that wasn't only true in his lifetime, as he tells people, hey, here's what Jesus did for me. Think about it, it's even true today. As we, right now, are going to learn from God's work in his life almost 2,000 years after the event. Now, after correcting his disciples' bad theology, he enlists them in ministry. Verse 4, "We must work the work of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one will work." Notice the we. We must work. Usually Jesus will say, I must work, I must do the Father's will, but not here. He says we must do God's will in the world while it is day, which I think means while he is still alive. But night, that is when he dies, they're not gonna be able to do ministry together anymore. Now, why do I think verse 4 is about Jesus' life and his death? Well, it's because of what he says in verse 5. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. As long as he is here and not back in heaven, he is the light of the world. Now, I talked in a previous message about what that title means, all the way back in chapter 8, verse 12. Basically, that Jesus is the only source of saving truth for the entire world. He is the light for the world. He is the only way to be forgiven, the only way to be saved, the only way to go to heaven. So in the text, what is the light of the world going to do when he meets physical blindness? Let's look, verse 6. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. Do you think the man freaked out when he heard Jesus spit on the ground? Like, do you think he did that? I actually don't think he freaked out. You know why? Because I don't think he had any clue what was happening. The text doesn't show he knew what Jesus was going to do. Jesus didn't say to him, I'm going to heal you now. Now, why do you think Jesus healed him like this? I mean, Jesus just could have said it, right? He just could have said, see, boom, everything would have worked. Like, why did he do it like this? I think there's a clue in John chapter 1, verse 3. It says, all things were made through Jesus. He made all things, which would include human beings. And how were human beings created? Genesis 2:7, quote, the Lord God formed the man out of dust from the ground. So like Jesus did in creation, Jesus took some dust, got it wet, made some mud, put it on his eyelids, and eyes that didn't exist, or eyes that existed but didn't work, miraculously came to life. Verse 7, and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. A real man was really healed when the real Jesus really healed him. This is what the Old Testament said the Messiah would do when he arrives. Like when John the Baptist's disciples asked Jesus if he was Messiah, and Jesus responds, Matthew 11:4, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight. That would point them back to texts like in the book of Isaiah that said this is what the Messiah would do when he arrives. I'm doing what the Messiah was predicted to do. And notice, unlike the con men with their fake healings in the prosperity movement, this man was healed completely. He was really healed, as in it wasn't a trick that Jesus played on these ignorant pre-modern people that, couldn't figure it out. He was so far above them. No. Think about it too. This man wasn't even expecting a healing. He didn't even ask to be healed. We'll see later, he doesn't even know who Jesus is, which means he doesn't have faith in Jesus, and that leads to his healing. He doesn't even know Jesus. This was a sovereign act of compassion. This is a sovereign act of divine mercy. Jesus heals this man who wasn't believing in him for it. He heals him, and he wasn't even asking for it. In fact, All Jesus said was go wash in the pool of Siloam. He didn't add, and you will receive your sight. I mean, think about it. He's sitting there. He hears Jesus talking to his disciples about something, and then he hears some commotion, and then he feels mud on his face. And notice the text. Jesus says, go wash that off. Look, he doesn't know what's going on here. He has no idea. Jesus doesn't say again, and you will be healed. So he goes to the pool, starts washing the mud off of his face, and a miracle occurs. Eyes grow out of nothing, or dead eyes came alive as cones and rods and neurons and lenses connect to his brain, and for the first time ever, he can see. This is our God. He's a God of compassion, a God of mercy towards those who are suffering. And since that is who he is, this is who we are to be. People who move towards the suffering, not away from them. Verse 4, notice, to work the works of God. In short, we're to treat the suffering not the same way we would want to be treated as if we were, like when we suffer. It's not just that. No, we're to treat them the way that God treats the suffering. And here in Jesus, we see a God of compassion and mercy. Sin is the cause of all suffering, sin in the world, and really sometimes sin between people. God sent his son Jesus to fix our sin problem by dying on the cross for sinners like you and like me. We did not have the ability to fix that problem, just like this man has no ability to fix his blindness. If it was going to be fixed at all, God was going to have to do it. And God did it. And before evil and sin is fixed forever, as we look out at the world and we wonder what in the world is going on and why is there so much evil, God's response to that is just wait. Just wait. One day all sin, all evil will be fixed. It will be no more. But until that day, just wait. Just wait, because I'm saving more sinners before I eradicate sin forever. So if he fixed sin, which is our ultimate problem, let's trust him for all the other problems that we face. Large ones, small ones, let's trust him no matter what. We see in Jesus here a compassionate God. So let's trust his heart of compassion whenever we face trials that tempt us to doubt his compassion. And remember, only God knows the answer to the question why, right? One day he will wipe away every tear from every believing eye. And I think maybe part of that will be answering all of our whys. But until then, when we don't know why, we do know who. So let's trust him. Now, this chapter is not about the man's healing. That only happens in the first 7 verses. This chapter is about Jesus, and it's about the many responses to this miracle. 27 verses are devoted to that. And in this middle section, we're going to see 3 groups of people who I call the mist. The mist, not M-I-S-T, though there is mist in their brain about Jesus, but M-I-S-S-E-D. Why? Because these 3 groups of people miss the miracle. And even more importantly, they miss how the miracle points to who Jesus really is. The first group who missed the point, we're going to call the public. Look at verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." I mean, it's okay to laugh at verse 9. Think about it. Here they are debating whether or not it's the man that they knew while he is standing right there. Notice some of them said he is like him. Like a twin? Like, what does it even mean? And then while debating back and forth with each other, the dude's sitting there going, "No, I'm the guy. I am the guy that you've seen all these years. Yeah, that's me." And notice it says he kept saying, which means he was doing it over and over again because they weren't listening to him. I want you to notice that this man who didn't believe in Jesus to heal him also has an incomplete understanding of Jesus. Look at verse 10. So they said to him, "Then how are your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." Like, duh, he was blind, right? Like, he doesn't know how is he going to know where Jesus is? He didn't even know who Jesus was. He doesn't know what he looks like. And notice he says that he is a man. Well, that's true. Jesus is a man, but it is incomplete. Now, it could be that his time with his neighbors is summarizing many days or maybe even a week, since verse 14 says it was the Sabbath day. But remember, the great day of the Feast of Tabernacles is also a Sabbath day. So again, this could all be the same day, which started all the way back in chapter 7, verse 37. Well, anyway, his neighbors, they don't know what to do with him. So they bring the man to the second group of people who missed the point, who always miss the point, the Pharisees. The religious leaders, the religious elite, the keepers of the law, the teachers, the influencers of the people. They hear the story. They realize Jesus made mud from spit. That's work. That's kneading dough. That's making clay. That's work, which they think that's a violation of God's Sabbath law when you're not supposed to work. Really, that was just a violation of their silly rules and not God's law. We see this in verse 16. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man," that's Jesus, "this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such things?" And there was a division among them. I mean, talk about missing the point. They want to know how the miracle took place, like trying to figure out how that magic trick worked. They care about how when they should have cared about who, which some of them, it seems, are coming around to. How can he do this and be a false teacher? They want to know, what does this formerly blind man think? And so is he a disciple? So verse 17. So they said to the blind man, they still call him the blind man, but he's not anymore. "What do you say about him since he has opened your eyes?" He said he is a prophet. Again, his knowledge of Jesus is true, but it's incomplete. Jesus was a prophet. He was the prophet, the Messiah. But as a prophet, that means, it makes sense because many Old Testament prophets performed miracles. Jesus did, and so Jesus would be a prophet, and that would mean God was with him, that he speaks from God. Pharisees don't like this, though, so they get the last group of people who missed the point, which is the parents of the man. They're called in for questioning, verse 18. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. And this is great. And asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind?" Like, who says that? Oh, I was just making it up. He's really not blind. And I know you're going to think that it's because of my sin that he's blind. And so, I just made it all up. No, there's not a chance. And then verse 20, these two would never, ever win Parent of the Year. Verse 20. His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes." This is great. "Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." You just throw their son under the bus. Don't ask us. It's his fault. Talk to him. They put this legal burden back onto him, and verse 22 says why. They're afraid. Afraid to get kicked out of the synagogue for saying Jesus was the Christ. He's the Messiah. So they caved to the pressure. So the Pharisees return to this guy. We have another round of missing the point as they cross-examine the man again, 24. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God." That's like, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "We know that this man, Jesus, is a sinner." Okay, talk about prejudicing the witness, right? We already come to our conclusion. We just want you to agree with us, so don't screw this up. Well, after the light of the world has shined on this guy, he's growing in clarity and he's growing in courage. Verse 27, he answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know." One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Anybody else here able to say that? I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, and now I see. The Pharisees refuse to consider who Jesus is. They return to, how did this miracle take place? But the man is not going to let them get away with this. Verse 27. He answered them, I have told you already how this happened, and you would not listen. Why do you not hear it again? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Like, he's getting a little cheeky now with them, right? He's frustrated. You can tell, and there's sarcasm coming out of him. You're going to see it clearly in verse 30. So they respond, they rebuke him. They say, hey, we're just trying to figure out the truth about Jesus. No, they weren't, and I can't help but laugh. Verse 30. The man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. Here's the sarcasm. You do not know where he comes from? You religious leaders, you experts in God, you do not know where he comes from? And yet he opened my eye. He did something only God can do. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. That's called getting owned. That's what that was. The teachers just went to school. And did you notice his understanding of Jesus is getting clear? Verse 33, Jesus is from God. And verse 31, Jesus is not a sinner, not a heretic, but a worshiper of God who God listens to. Well, to all of that, they insult the man, verse 34, and they, quote, cast him out. So it could be that they just kicked him out of their presence, or it could be that he got what his parents were afraid of. It could be that he was excommunicated from the synagogue, which means that he is now considered an apostate. He's a sinner. He is to be rejected and shunned for the rest of his life unless he repents. Now, as we've seen throughout John, actually starting in chapter 5 and coming all the way into this chapter now, we've seen that it's not just Jesus and not this man, but that this is how Jesus' followers are going to be treated. You see, when the light of truth, when the light of salvation, when it shines from you into the lives of those who love the darkness, you can expect that the result will be the same as what this man got. People won't believe you. People, even close family and friends, they won't stand with you. Some will abandon you, and some will even mock you and insult you and rebuke you and cancel you. You see, we admire this man for what he went through, but we don't want to do what we admire him for, because like the man's parents, we're afraid to. We're afraid of backlash. We're afraid of mockery. We're afraid of loss. But listen, as our days grow darker and darker, you and I, we're going to be forced more and more to choose between being faithful or being liked, being faithful or being comfortable, being faithful or hiding the truth. Now, this account in John 9 ends where the chapter started. Remember where the chapter started? It started with this man and Jesus. And here it ends with this man in point number 3, the Messiah. The Messiah. This text, this account, this miracle is not about the man. It's about Jesus. You see, John, one of Jesus' 12 disciples and the author of this book, he tells us what all the miracles in his book are about. In chapter 20, verse 30, he writes this: Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, many other miracles, which are not written in this book. But these, including this one in chapter 9, these miracles are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, I don't think John saw the need to convince anybody that Jesus was a man. Anyone that interacted with Jesus, anybody that heard about Jesus would automatically know he is a man. As I've said before, he didn't have some kind of glow coming out of him unlike everybody else. He actually used his feet. He didn't float everywhere. He was human, just as human as you and me, yet without sin. No, he writes to convince people that this man, Jesus, was the Messiah, and that this man, Jesus, was also God in the flesh. And so he writes this gospel to convince people of that. In other words, if Jesus did what the Old Testament promised the Messiah would do, then he is the Messiah. He is the Christ. And if he did what only God can do, which is create eyes out of nothing, or cause eyes that have never worked to suddenly and completely work again, if he can do that, that's something only God can do. And if he does that, then he is God, God who became a man to save men from our sins. And John concludes that text by saying Jesus will do all of that for those who believe in him, who put their trust in him. So that what John wants to happen for all who read his book is what happens to the man born blind. He believes in Jesus and is saved, and that's what we're going to see here at the end. See, the issue at the end of the chapter is what should have been the issue all throughout the chapter. Who is Jesus? And how should we respond to him? Take a look, verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Interesting, Jesus sought the man out after the religious leaders kicked him out. And he answered Jesus, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" See, 5 times in chapter 9, Jesus is called the man. Here, he is called the Son of Man. That's a title that goes all the way back to Daniel chapter 7. And this figure who can go into the presence of God, even though he is a man, can go into the presence of God as an equal. And then while there, God gives him authority over the entire earth. Jesus says, that's me. This man is eager to believe in him, but he doesn't know who he is. Remember, he's only heard Jesus' voice. He's never seen Jesus' face until now. So Jesus, verse 37, said to him, "You have seen him, the Son of Man, and it is he who is speaking to you." But when did he see Jesus? He didn't, but he did. He didn't see him, but he saw him because he saw him spiritually, even though this is the first time he is seeing him physically. And think about it, this man, well, let's keep reading, verse 38. He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. So this man goes from Jesus is a man, verse 11, to Jesus is the Lord. He is God. And because the man born blind now sees Jesus clearly and rightly as God, what does he do? He worshiped him, which is blasphemy, unless that's exactly who Jesus is. And notice Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, stop that, don't do that. That's unacceptable behavior." No, Jesus receives the worship. Why? Because that's who he is, the one to be worshiped, God in the flesh. Then the chapter ends with this message and the Pharisees' response to it. Verse 39, Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." With these words, Jesus shows that this man born blind is not only a real man, but he is also an illustration of spiritual blindness. Those who are spiritually blind will see Jesus. Those who think they already see the truth about Jesus and reject him, they're actually blind. And verse 39, under God's judgment. See, the blindness the Messiah was promised to heal in the Old Testament wasn't only physical, it was also spiritual. They would see the truth when the light of the world shines into their lives. Spiritual blindness is the worst kind of blindness, though, because it convinces people, like these Pharisees, that they clearly see when the truth is they're blind. Think about it. The man born physically blind is the only one in the chapter who sees Jesus clearly. While all the people in John chapter 9 who were born with physical sight, they failed to see Jesus clearly. The man was blind, and yet he saw. The Pharisees saw the truth. They had the evidence. That's the point of this text. They're trying to sift through all the evidence to get to the facts that are staring them right in the face. They were blind, so they reject Jesus. And it wasn't just this man who was born blind. What we learn from this text really is that we are all born blind. We may not be physically blind, but we are spiritually blind. And what Jesus did for this man, giving physical sight, he did again at the end, giving him spiritual sight. The question at the end of John chapter 9 is not what happened to this man. The question at the end is, has your blindness been healed? 2 Corinthians 4:4 describes all who don't believe in Jesus as having minds that are, quote, blinded by the god of this world, Satan. In this blindness, they are kept, quote, from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. They don't see Jesus clearly. They don't see how wonderful he is, and so they reject him. Why? Because they're blind. In the end, people who think they see, but they don't, in the words of 1 John 2:11, they quote, that is because the darkness has blinded their eyes, not their physical eyes, the eyes of their heart. This is the truth about all who don't believe in Jesus. They are blind, unable to see the truth about him. But Jesus, the light of the world, he still comes to the spiritually blind, and he still gives them sight so that they can see the truth and believe in him and be saved from the punishment they deserve for all of their crimes against God. So again, has your blindness been healed? If it hasn't, Jesus is alive, and he will do it again for you. Come and believe in him. Let's pray. Jesus, this text is a powerful testimony to your kindness, your power, your grace, your mercy, and your conviction. Thank you for making these things clear. If these things are clear to us about you, we can see in a text like this one that it's only because you opened our eyes to the truth. I pray that you would use this text in the lives of those who are hearing me now who are still spiritually blind because they reject you. Work in their hearts, work in their souls, give them sight so they can see the truth about you and respond by trusting in you. It's what we celebrate today as we look at your word, and it's what we will celebrate now as we take communion. Continue to bless our time of worship today. Amen. Hey, thanks for tuning in to our Redeemer YouTube channel. If this is helpful for you, please make sure that you like this video, smash the subscribe button, and hit that bell icon. It will help us reach more people with biblical truth. Thank you so much.